first I just want to thank the Quattrone Center for hosting this book talk. My name is Seema Safi. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers.
I don't think we can hear you at all anymore. The mic isn't working.
We're not trying to be offensive. We're simply trying to.
We don't want to miss any of what you are saying.
So maybe just.
Let's see if mine's working. Hello? Yes. Okay, so we'll like this. Okay.
It's better.
I will refrain from introducing myself for the third time.
We didn't get the first two.
Well, I'm really thrilled and honored to be moderating this dialogue with two leading scholar activists who've been thinking imaginatively in ways that move beyond traditional reforms. We are dispensing with long introductions. I'll just briefly situate our discussion today and then introduce our speakers. Specific to today's conversation, Professor Jocelyn Simonson and Professor Dorothy Roberts have thought about, written about, and extensively engaged with communities directly impacted by the criminal legal system and by the family policing system in ways that have opened up new possibilities for structural and transformative change. In their groundbreaking scholarship, both Professor Simonson and Professor Roberts have thought and spoken about this engagement with bottom-up knowledge and bottom-up contestation as essential to dismantling unjust systems. Jocelyn Simonson is a professor of law and the Associate Dean for Research and Scholarship at Brooklyn Law School, and the author of much pioneering scholarship, including her incredible and deeply inspiring book, Radical Acts of Justice: How Ordinary People are Dismantling Mass Incarceration. Dorothy Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, and the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander Professor of Civil Rights here at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. Professor Roberts is the author of many path-breaking books, but most recently Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. Thank you so much to Professor Simonson and Professor Roberts for being here and leading this fascinating and important conversation. We will engage for about 45 minutes, and maybe a little less, just until about 6:15, and then we will open it up to the audience for questions. Jocelyn, your book really is just a gift to understanding the power of what you describe as everyday people engaging in collective acts of resistance to challenge dominant ideas about the criminal legal system. Could you tell us and talk a little bit about your motivation for writing this book and what it's about?
Sure, I will do that in a second, but first I want to just say hi and thank you. Thank you to the Quattrone Center for having me. Thank you to Dorothy for being in conversation. Her book is out in paperback today, by the way. And thank you to Seema. Everyone should check out her work as well. She's also writing path-breaking legal scholarship about thinking that's actually coming from inside of prisons by people working collectively to critique things in ways that others haven't. So thank you. And thanks everyone for coming out on this beautiful day. So my motivation for writing the book. So this book comes from about a decade or so of writing and thinking that I have been doing in conversation and in community with organizers, activists, and people who are spending time trying to help people caught up in the criminal system in some way. Before that, I was a public defender for about 5 years in the Bronx. And when I was a public defender, I was increasingly frustrated by the hold that the criminal system had on poor people in New York City, especially poor people of color, especially Black people. And I saw so many people from so many different areas of the system wanting it to be different, sometimes wanting it to be better, sometimes thinking it shouldn't exist at all, but not always sure how to act collectively, even if they had this instinct that we should be organizing or trying to change things. And it wasn't until after I was a public defender that I started to be in rooms and spaces with groups that seemed to be engaging with the system in a way that I had not experienced before. Groups that were forming community bail funds that got together to bail strangers out of jail out of a broader sense of injustice for holding somebody in a cage when they're still presumed innocent. Groups that were getting together to do court watching projects and try to hold DAs and judges accountable for what they said were happening in court, but then also build power and ideas about how justice should or could work outside of the system. And groups that were engaging in different kinds of collective and participatory defense. Again, groups of people coming together and showing care and love and attention and thinking together about individual cases and then connecting those individual cases to broader ideas about how things can be. And there was no one act or one moment that felt like a big aha, this feels like it's going to change the world. But in being in conversation and sometimes being part of groups that were doing these things, I started to see change happening. And sometimes that change was in how people think and talk to each other. A lot of times that change was actually through the action, kind of the care and the love that people showed each other while trying to help people within the system. Seemed to show some other sparks of ideas and justice and safety in contrast to the system. And then the system itself, judges and prosecutors and elected officials, reacting really strangely and provocatively with incredible backlash against acts that don't necessarily seem like that intense or that much of a resistance, I think started to show me the power. And so over this time, I've been writing sometimes academic law review articles, sometimes just in conversation with groups trying to think through theoretically what they're doing. And in this book, I try to tell the stories a little more concretely about some of the things that organizers have been doing. It's really a story of organizing over the last 8 years or so. So to take the example of community bail funds, and what a pleasure to be talking here in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is in literally every chapter, I believe, including the community bail funds chapter, because you have two amazing and long-standing community bail funds here in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Bail Fund and the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund. And both of them were started around 2016 and 2017. But if we go back to 2015, there were 3 community bail funds operating in the United States. I was in rooms with them at the time. If you fast forward a couple years, there were more, including the 2 you have here, one of which came from a Black Mamas bailout, and one of which came from organizers coming together, having been thinking about people directly impacted by the system, being directly impacted themselves, and starting to think about a community bail fund as a form of change they wanted to engage in. And then if we fast forward to 2020, there were more than 100 community bail funds operating around the country. And this is true of each of the tactics in the book, that if we go back 8 or 9 years, they're happening, and they've been happening a long time. But these are tactics that, for whatever reason, I think I know the reasons, have really taken off. And so to take the example of community bail funds and think a little bit about their power, in the book I do talk about how here in Philadelphia, the power of the bail funds here comes from the love and care that people show each other when they bail each other out, but also from the collective knowledge and power that is built when the bail fund does things like court watching. So Philadelphia Bail Watch watches magistrates set bail here in their local courthouse. They have written reports about what they've seen, reports that have been thrown back at them by your district attorney out of frustration that they're being watched and written about. Reports that have shown that just the act of sitting there and observing changes how judges act when suddenly the public is watching them. And the Philadelphia Bail Fund has in recent years been really taking its organizing out to knock on doors and to do their own bottom-up research in ways that actually parallels a lot of the things that Seema writes about, to try to imagine, try to understand what safety means to people and try to think about it in other So that's sort of a long answer about what motivated me to write the book. I guess I could have just said Philadelphia. But I wanted to put some concrete stories to some of the bigger ideas that I've been talking about with organizers and with my colleagues.
So one of the most exciting parts about having both of you in dialogue together is the parallels, Dorothy. In your work, you've spoken about how your books have been influenced by and benefited from an essential engagement with activists. In writing your prior book, Shattered Bonds, you described how your work on the family policing system, what some call the child welfare system, was greatly influenced by a group of mothers meeting in a church basement in Englewood in Chicago, and now with Torn Apart, you have been engaged with a much larger activist community. Can you talk a bit about these collective interventions and organizing by families, parents, mothers, and even, it sounds like, increasingly children in the foster, who've experienced foster care, and how it has influenced your work and also influenced broader system critiques?
That's a big question, and also thanks to the Quattrone Center for putting together this program, and to Seema and Jocelyn for engaging in this conversation, and for the work both of you are doing. So I can't imagine writing any of my books, going back to Killing the Black Body, without being engaged with organizers and activists and working collectively with a movement. Even going back to Killing the Black Body, which was published in 1997, that came out of my opposition to prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs. And I could not have written that without the help of their attorneys, who gave me information about the prosecutions, but also without being engaged in a growing reproductive justice movement that helped me to understand the harms of the prosecutions and the ideas we needed to fight them. With Shattered Bonds, which I wrote after discovering that there were tens of thousands of more Black mothers who maybe weren't being prosecuted, but their newborns were being taken from them. That's how I discovered the family policing system. I hadn't been impacted by it personally, but I very soon got to know some of those mothers, including this group that met in Englewood on the south side of Chicago. Was a small group of mothers who got together. At that point, they didn't have the ability to challenge the system directly, but it was really a group of peer support and caring. As Jocelyn writes about, the idea of community care and support is underlying all of these activist movements, whether we're talking about court watching or bail funds or participatory defense. Underlying it is this idea of strangers coming together and working toward a different way of caring for each other. And that's really what this small group was doing. And so that's what helped me to understand how the system actually operates. You can't understand how a system operates if you don't know the people and learn from the people who are affected by it. Because these systems pretend to be something they're not. And the family policing system is maybe the biggest propaganda hoax that people at least know that prisons are terrible places to be. But most people think that the so-called child welfare system is actually a benevolent social service system that keeps children safer. And you would not know that it's the opposite of that if you didn't learn from, listen to, walk beside the people who are impacted by it. And that's how I learned about how it actually operates, by getting to know Black mothers whose children have been taken from them. And so there's just that basic information about the reality of how the systems work. And then there's the way in which these mothers, and I'm going back just to this early group, but even though they were small and didn't have a lot of resources or power, they still have powerful ideas and visions. And so they contested the stereotypes that underlie this system, which is that the parents whose children are taken from them are terrible parents. They don't really care about their children, and they need to be fixed. And these mothers were the opposite of that. They were fighting with every breath they had to get their children back because they cared so much about their children. And they were fighting against a system that threw every barrier in front of them and defamed them, degraded them, tried to dehumanize them, and punished them for the care they gave to their children. Because if you oppose anything that's you're mandated to do, that's a sign that you're not compliant. And so there's this deep contradiction that even the care you show for your children is used against you. And I could spend hours talking about just that basic pathological aspect of the system. But the other thing was, even at the level of ideology, they described what was happening to them as their children were being kidnapped from them. This was a form of enslavement. You know, they had ideas about how the system operated that were ideas that I could also share and adopt in my work. In fact, if I think about now and torn apart, I trace the origins of the system back to slavery. Well, these mothers were calling it without having all the research and the knowledge about it. They knew that it was a form of slavery. They talk about weaponizing their children against them. You know, they talked about how they had to rely on the system for resources because everything else had been stripped out of their neighborhoods. Every other form of support had been taken away, and they relied on it, many of them, for resources, but they wanted to be able to get support for their children without the coercive, disruptive, violent interventions in their families. So for example, one mother said to me, and I quoted this in an article I wrote back in 2006, if you look in the bus, it says, call the child abuse hotline if you're being abused. It doesn't say call if you need money for groceries. It doesn't say call if you need more shoes for your kids. You know, it doesn't say call if you need health care. It calls, you call only if you want to confess you're harming your children or you've been harmed. And so why would you want to call? You know, in that was the contesting this idea that harm to children is caused by pathological parents, not by conditions of poverty and structural racism, which really are the main harms to children. And so those mothers were contesting on multiple levels the myths about family policing that many people believe. Now, today, just in that time, that was 20 years ago, but in those intervening decades, there's been a massive change in the organizing of parents, mostly Black mothers at the forefront, but many, many others joining a movement to abolish the family policing system. And that is important to my work. It's important to making these changes. For me, it's important because I want to know that my research is useful to people who want to make change. So that's an important part as well, not just learning, but also making sure that what I write about and the work I do is useful to people who are actually affected by these systems. And as Jocelyn points out in her book, there are victories. There are victories that are happening because of these movements. I'll end answering that question just by pointing out the number of parallels I saw reading Radical Acts of Justice and Jocelyn's focus on anti-prison and other opposition to carceral systems like police and prisons. But there's very similar kinds of organizing being done in the family policing abolition movement. So there's a parallel. Court watchers, talk about Philadelphia, DHS Give Us Back Our Children here in Philadelphia, has been accompanying parents in family court to show support. The bail funds, you point out in the book, one of the very first ones was Black Mamas bailout, and part of the reason why Black mamas have been so supportive of bailing out each other is because when you are incarcerated, when you're jailed, you are at high risk of losing your children. So it's not a coincidence that it's Black mamas. These are mothers who are fighting to keep their children, and it shows the deep intersection between family policing and prisons. And then participatory defense, the ways in which system impacted parents and children are more and more involved in strategizing about not only defense before court, but also strategies for ending family policing, and also family defenders. The rise of units of family defenders that represent parents to keep children with their families, which are multidisciplinary and have not only lawyers but social workers who don't work for the state and can keep the confidences of clients. That's important, but also peer advocates, other parents who have experienced the terror of the system and can contribute to the strategies for keeping families together. So all of that I was really just so thrilled at all of the intersections and parallels with the movements that we're talking about.
So one intersection that I'm hearing now is how mothers, community members, strangers are contesting dominant understandings of public safety, of, at least in the criminal legal system, the will of the people. When you see the case caption, people versus whoever, the idea that the people is only the prosecution and the police, and that contestation begins to infuse new competing alternative ideas of public safety, care, justice. And so Jocelyn, your book offers such a concrete and really clear depiction of what it means to build power. And I was wondering if with all the rich examples and all the rich stories that are in this book, it made that concept of building power more understandable, and it also made it more realistically conceivable. And you write about the impact that collective interventions by everyday people have had beyond individual cases, and specifically you argue that with every small incremental change that occurs because of collective action, power is not only built, but power is shifted. And could you talk a little bit about what that means when you talk about the power shifts that can flow from that type of power building?
Sure. I think it goes back to this idea of ideological struggle that Dorothy was bringing out, and the way that people can materially, by helping people, actually assisting people get back their kids, get out of jail, whatever it might be, actually engage in really profound ideological work by opening up these contradictions in a way that is not just theoretical, but actually shifts the power, because we have these systems that only exist because they're held up by these ideas that we assume to be true. Or if we think they're sort of not true, we don't deeply question them. Because if we deeply question them, then these systems could not stand. We would just be pulling out the rug from under them. One of those ideas would be that when we talk about public safety and the state providing public safety, what we mean is that we have police and criminal courts and ACS, what's ACS here? And DHS, and the family policing system. And that's how the state keeps people safe, even if there are other ways that we might keep people safe. And you might, in sort of, theoretically think of other understandings of safety. But the kinds of tactics and organizing that I write about and that Dorothy writes about involves people coming into these systems that claim to be the place where you can find safety and the official place to find justice, literally written on the walls, and helping people try to get out of being entangled in them, and by doing so, actually living out other understandings of justice and safety. So that's sort of where the ideological contradiction comes in. And this idea of the people gets layered on top of it. So I was a public defender in New York State, where it's the people in the state of New York versus Jocelyn Simonson in every case. We're probably familiar with this idea from the opening of Law and Order. It's the caption in a number of states that the prosecutors are the people. And in New York, we literally call them the people. But it's still this idea that it's we have democratically chosen to be represented by the people who are prosecuting people, taking away kids, putting people in cages. And so when a group like the Philadelphia Bail Fund or the Philadelphia Community Bail Fund or the Philadelphia Black Mamas Bailout comes along and collects money from lots of people and then bails out somebody they don't know, a stranger, and takes care of that person and then does it again and then does it again and then does it again, they're actually living out a really different understanding of who the people are, right? It can no longer be true that the prosecutor is the people. Now it turns out there are lots of different people with different ideas of what makes people safe. These groups feel safer when people are not sitting in cages while still presumed innocent. They feel safer when they're able to be home with their families. They feel safer when they're able to go back to their jobs. And they think of jails as not being safe places. That's a different understanding. And if they're doing that again and again, and they're doing it publicly, and they're having press conferences, here they had the People's Hearing on pretrial justice, and they're living out these other understandings, the system can no longer say we are the place to find public safety. It exposes that there's different ways to do it. And then all of a sudden we have a debate on our hands over what public safety means, which we have now, and which we haven't always had. So it's the, just opening up the question actually is incredibly powerful. And as I said, officials really don't like it, right? They don't want to talk about the meaning of public safety. They want to go back to us just being the place where we understand that when I say I'm in favor of public safety when I'm running for office, you understand me to mean I think we need more and better policing. That can't be the only thing it means to be a candidate in favor of public safety. And now we actually have, in Seattle, there are people who are running for city council and winning, saying they are in favor of public safety, and then in the next sentence saying they want fewer police and more schools and infrastructure. So that's sort of part of the way the power comes out. It's literally helping people and freeing people, engaging in this material collective work, and then opening up these ideological fissures that shift political power in bigger ways.
Yeah, that is exactly what happens in the movement to abolish family policing, because just as you said, when a public figure says, I believe in public safety, and we're supposed to think, oh, that means more police in prisons. Same thing with children. I believe in protecting children. Oh, that means we have lots of mandated reporters and we take lots of children away from terrible parents. Not that it means, oh, we make sure that families have the concrete resources they need to take care of their children so that children actually will be able to thrive because they have adequate, not just adequate, but good, secure, high-quality housing and medical care and educational supports and all that children need in order to be healthy and thrive in our society. And what these abolitionists say is that not only does it not mean taking children away, making children safe, but actually what the system does is harm children. It takes children away from their families and puts them into what is well documented to be an extremely harmful foster care system. Well known that being in foster care is a risk for incarceration later in life, for going into juvenile detention, for PTSD, for the trauma of being separated from your families and friends and classmates and neighbors. And then on top of that, the idea that it keeps children safer if everybody reports on their suspicions of child maltreatment, especially professionals who are trained to care for children. That idea is extremely harmful because now you have professionals who could be helping you to care for your children, doctors and teachers and social workers, where people could go to get help, but instead they're afraid to go because they're afraid that it'll lead to getting their children taken from them. And it's not because they want to harm their children, it's because they know the risk that their children will be harmed by being taken from them. And they know of lots of cases where children have been taken because of poverty and because of biases in the reporting and the decisions to remove children. And so safety doesn't mean family separation, doesn't mean putting children in substitute care. Safety means having communities that are well supported, that have the resources that people need to take care of children, and having hubs where people, within communities, where people can go for support. And maybe I just need to make it clear that the main reason why children are taken from their families by the family policing system is because of neglect, so-called neglect, which is completely confused with poverty. It's actually defined in state statutes as the failure to meet children's material needs. And it might be specified housing or clothing or food or education. But most parents who don't provide those needs for their children fail, not because they want to deprive their children, it's because they can't afford it. They don't have those resources. And the way to meet their children's needs would be to provide them with those resources, or to have a society where that provision is just part of how we care for each other. And instead, this system takes children away or threatens to do it, surveils families, investigates families, acts in all of these very carceral ways, and doesn't provide what would actually keep children safe. And so what these mothers and others who, and former foster youth are saying is, this is not safety. We have another way of imagining a safe society where it means the opposite of what the family policing system does. And they also enacted, as you're saying, Jocelyn, by providing networks, creating networks within communities that care for each other, that provide what families need to support their children. One example of that, which is so powerful, is something that a professor at NYU, Anna Ahrens, calls the unintended abolition of the family policing system in New York during the COVID pandemic, when people were afraid that during the lockdown in New York City, all these children would be abused because they were with their parents, who were presumed to be pathological, and the ACS basically shut down. If they were not going in and investigating the high numbers of families they ordinarily would do, and family courts were not taking children away at the same high rates. And there was this prediction there'd be this spike in child abuse. And in fact, the opposite happened. There, nationally as well, no spike in child abuse. And it may even be that children were safer during that period. And the reason Anna Ahrens says, which I think is very compelling, is because the federal government was sending income to families during that time, and mutual aid organizations sprang into action and distributed concrete resources like groceries and diapers and things like that to families. And so children were safer that way. I mean, I think there's that's just an example of how we know that children can be safer if families have the resources they need. We don't have to rely on family separation, on child removal, on weaponizing children as a way of keeping them safe.
So one concrete example of this idea of collective care being criminalized that's been in the news of late that you, Jocelyn, have been thinking and writing about, not to call her out, but Amna Akbar has also been thinking and writing about is Cop City. And I was wondering if, it just shows the power of this collective work, and if you could talk a little bit about what's happening right now in the context of Cop City. I thought we would do how we came to abolition, but that would maybe take more than 2 minutes.
Sure.
We can do it quickly. I won't give this. I promise. I won't give lengthy answers anymore.
I'll do both. I would love to talk about Cop City for a minute, and then if people are interested in questions, we could open it up to more detail about Cop City. Again, you can read Amna's work or others' work sort of talking about this long-standing, years-long movement going on in Atlanta to stop the city from paying tens of millions of dollars to lease land that is currently forest, raise the forest, and build a police training facility that would include a mock city, therefore, called by activists Cop City. And this movement is really large, has lots of different tactics that we can talk about. But one of the things that has happened since I finished the book, in the book I write about backlash, but I didn't even fathom, and this book just came out, it's not like been that long ago, what's happened in Georgia, which is that there have been charges filed both in the local court and, by local prosecutors and by the state attorney general against activists who run the Atlanta Solidarity Fund, which acts in part as a bail fund. And the charges are literally that to pay bail for people is money laundering. And then there's a state-level RICO indictment of 61 activists. And I don't know if there are any law students here, but if you learn about conspiracy, you need an overt act. It's a 106-page long indictment. Many of those pages are listing overt acts, and many of those overt acts are giving people food, giving people harm reduction supplies, giving people what they need to take care of each other, and paying their bail. So there's this literal criminalization of people taking care of each other, including through the paying of bail, and just saying that is criminal activity. I mean, they're just saying it, as opposed to other forms of backlash that have more nuanced ways of trying to get back at it. So it's scary, it shows the power of collective care, and I think it also situates something like paying bail as a larger act of solidarity that can be part of social movements that have discrete but really big political objectives.
All right, we have exactly 15 minutes left for questions. Anyone has questions for our panelists?
Thank you, both of you. I've got a reading list. I've just been writing down all the titles as you I wonder if both of you could talk a little bit about the things I heard from both of you that oftentimes how to resolve something comes boots on the ground, in process, conversations, meeting with people. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what are some of the considerations that you have in your own head when you go into those gatherings. What are the things you're looking for? I'm not looking for a top 10 list, but like, is there harm? How is harm? Who was affected by the harm? Who's responsible for those kinds of things?
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question for the people online?
Sure. The question was for both of us to think about when we're entering spaces, and I'm thinking organizing in activist spaces. We could also think about courtrooms more broadly, which can be activist spaces. How are we approaching it, and what questions are we asking? And I don't have a set of questions I ask, but I can sort of try to think about how I approach it. And it's going to depend if I'm, say, doing, structured interviews for a book, is I think less what we're talking about than when I'm going to a meeting of community bail fund activists to talk about the ongoing work. And I'm on the advisory board of the National Bail Fund Network. And so over the last decade, I've been in a lot of rooms with organizers from community bail funds from around the country, sometimes one, sometimes a lot of them. And when I am there, it is rarely to give any answers to what people should do. But what I started to do early on is write about community bail funds when there were only 3 or 4 of them operating. And so I would ask them what they were doing. They weren't necessarily in conversation with each other. And sort of hear from them what it is they've learned rather than ask the question. Like, I didn't necessarily have the question. It's sort of like, what questions are you asking? But then, because I'm a law professor and I have the privilege to write and think, and I've lost students who can write and think along with me, I'm able then to write a 25,000 word law review article that sort of takes a step back and theorizes about the power of what these groups are doing. And then I can bring that law review article back to a National Bail Fund Network gathering, and people can say, wow, you're right, we are doing something really powerful. It's sort of like, it can be really important to hear what it is that's powerful about your own work. And then the terms and language that I use in my work become adopted by the community bail fund. So it's kind of an iterative theorizing. And so my ideas just wouldn't exist without the conversations. In other words, they're not my ideas. That's my big secret, right? They're ideas that are coming from the ground up, and then I'm just trying to give a voice to in some way.
Yeah, my answer would be very similar. I would just say, though, that it's sometimes hard for me to distinguish between my research and my building relationships with people, because I meet people through interviewing them, but also often end up with a long-term relationship. Whether it's those mothers I met back in 2000 in the basement of a church in Englewood, or someone like Joyce McMillan. I say whenever I talk about family policing abolition, I have to talk about Joyce McMillan in New York City, who founded JMAC for Families. So I've interviewed her. I quote her in my book Torn Apart, but we also work closely together on organizing and various activist projects. But when I think about my relationship with Joyce, it's usually, what do you want me to do? Where do you want me to testify? What research can I help with? What brief can I write? Same thing with DHS Give Us Back Our Children here in Philadelphia. Our relationship has been, how can I be helpful? What police department do you want me to go in and argue with people, about? How can I help with a brief, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, as Jocelyn's saying, Joyce says to me all the time, Ms. McMillan says to me, and she refuses to call me Dorothy, it's always, Professor Dorothy or something like that. But she will say, your book put into words what I have been trying to say. Or we can use your book to prove that what we've been saying is true. And I feel, as Jocelyn does, I feel, it's the opposite. You inspired me to write this book, you and many, many others. I do want this book to be useful, but you helped me to understand how it could be useful. And you've contributed so much to so many of the ideas in the book. So yes, it's a very symbiotic, iterative, kind of wonderful relationship, I think. Mm-hmm. That's just a big joy of my career, is being able to have those kinds of relationships.
Yeah, and I know we have other questions, but just to tag on the end of it, I've been asked a few times in talking about the book, who was the audience, who did you write it for? And when I was writing it, I would often say, this is not a book for organizers. it's a book for everyone else, like people to learn about the organizing that's happening. And yet, as I've been going to cities and having conversations with organizers, it's turned out I'm wrong. And that organizers are like, thank you for writing this book that shows that what we're doing is important.
Exactly,
So, and I hadn't thought about it that way when writing it.
Hi, thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it. You answered a few of my questions already, but you were talking about like the bail funds and, you know, the new strategy of the state retaliating with RICO charges and things of that nature. And it kind of led me to questioning, you know, when the state does retaliate against these organizing tactics, how can we as people of, you know, I mean, as like a white law student, I am of a massive amount of privilege, and even people that just have a lot of privilege in general, how can we like come together to, I guess, support people that are being retaliated by the state when the state is kind of saying that support is not legal?
Right, that's really hard, right? So it's turning out, so I mean, it's always been true that all of this organizing we're talking about, and also the organizing that Seema writes about inside of prison, we are in a place, maybe we've always been, that when you help other people, you're putting yourself at risk, because to help marginalized people is to expose the state for how it neglects marginalized people, for how it's created that marginalization. And the state reacts with backlash toward that. And this, what's happening with the prosecution of the Solidarity Fund and activists, I mean, legal observers are part of it too, it's really quite a range, is a new iteration of this. And it's scary, and so it's up to every individual person to know for themselves, like their positionality and their identity, but also just how much of their body they can put on the line, right? And there's nothing wrong with saying, I cannot be arrested because whatever the reason is for you. And that risk is greater than it ever has been before. On the other hand, we need law students and lawyers to join in the collective defense efforts that are, there are many meetings and thinking through right now how that's going to happen. But there's going to need to be a lot of lawyering, and then also a lot of participatory and collective defense that doesn't involve lawyers. So sometimes it means knowing what room not to be in addition to what room to be in. And so I think approaching it with humility, but if you can, approaching it in some way, right? Not staying away, being a part of it. I think what's been incredible in Atlanta is that it is absolutely a local fight. The leaders are local, so much of what's happening is local, but they are also asking for everybody to join in solidarity in various forms, whether from where they are or to come down for weeks of action. So if you're up for it, there's always something you can do, but it involves listening to the people who are there as to what it is that you can do.
If I might, I'm one of the facilitators of a local hub here, a local participatory defense hub, and I'm thinking about your question. And also,
which one?
The South Philly Participatory Defense Hub. It's still a lot to say after 5 years. And thinking about what you said, Jocelyn, about those rooms and like what are the fights of lawyers, because I there are many, and we don't necessarily always want to occupy spaces with lawyers or like have them tell us what to do, but it is a partnership, and locally, like even last night, like we're supporting someone who's got an immigration hearing, and it's not a system we know that much about, and his lawyers took the opportunity to come to our meeting and explain some of those proceedings to us, so we had a better understanding not only of the overarching system, but ways within it that we could support this person and hopefully render a better outcome from that case. So like lawyers are really important from the understanding and structural part of this, and also like when it comes to things like criminalizing compassionate acts. Of course we need lawyers in those fields to like combat that narrative. and they will have a certain, like there's an audience that they can reach, and certainly spaces that they can occupy better than other people can.
Yeah, and having that confidentiality is important as well. Kathleen Creamer, who is the head of the Family Defense Unit at Community Legal Services, has said that the one place where impoverished, marginalized mothers can come to really talk about their needs and the problems they may have is her office, and offices like hers. Everybody else is a mandated reporter. There's no place else that's safe, and therefore that office can have social workers and other peer advocates there that provide a space where someone can come and say, this is what I need to raise my children, to take care of my children, help me find a way to do it. And they can provide support without the fear that the parents will be turned in to the state just for seeking help.
Yeah, hearing you talk about the lawyer come in to give information about immigration hearing, that sounds like a productive thing for a lawyer to do.
Absolutely.
But I imagine that your hub and no participatory defense hub would want the lawyer to be able to come in and set the limits of what's possible or what can be done, right? It's just here are some legal things that maybe you didn't know about that you can do, but that is not even the limits, it's a fraction of what you can do. And in my chapter on participatory defense, I write about hubs like yours that have really, again, proliferated in the last decade or so around the country, as well as larger collective defense campaigns, like those of Survived and Punished New York, that focus on criminalized survivors. And again, the lawyers appear throughout the chapter, sometimes as very hostile to these efforts, but sometimes as friends to these efforts. But even when they are friends, they can still come in with our lawyer minds and set limits without meaning to. And so one of the people I was in conversation with a lot for this book was Raj Jayadav. He's in San Jose, California, and started Silicon Valley Debug, actually now a couple decades ago. And they pioneered a certain form of participatory defense hub that now is the National Participatory Defense Network. In other words, he's been doing this a long time. And I had many Zoom interviews with him. I've known him, I've actually met him at a bail fund conference in 2015 or so, but for this book, he sat down for many hours with me. It was really generous with his time. And there was one Zoom where he arrived late, and he was like, I'm sorry I'm late. And he was just like so pumped, and I wanted to understand why. And he had just come from a sentencing hearing. And again, he's been to now like hundreds of sentencing hearings as part of Debug's hub. And it was the hearing where a public defender who he has love for, who they're in community with, had told the hub more than a year ago, this is a case where you will not be able to not get jail time. I'm telling you, I know the case, I know the judge, I know the courthouse, I'm here to help you and help the hub understand this is not the kind of case that ends in no jail time. And he had just come back from the sentencing hearing, and their hub member had been, the case was over, no jail time. And he was just sort of like, this is what I'm saying, right? They say it's impossible, and it's possible, and here he was just like, you forget, Raj Jayadav forgets, and then it happens, and he's like, that's right, it's not impossible. And yeah.
It's almost the reverse relationship, I think, that's most productive, is where the organizers say, we want to know how we can do this. You tell me, you don't have the option to say you can't do it.
Right.
You have to figure out, using every tool that you have in your legal toolbox, to say, here's how we're going to advocate for what you say you want. And this happens all the time, I think, that activists say, we think we have a right to this, or we think that this is unjust. Now figure out how we're going to argue that, as opposed to you coming and saying you can't argue it. No, that's not going to work. Yeah.
There's two more questions at 6:30. I don't know if we want to just take both and then see if
that's okay with me.
Yeah, let's do that.
I mean, once upon a time, particularly around the Black Power movement. The theme was empowerment. We want to have power. We want to be able to control our lives. When you talk about this love, it's love for community, not necessarily, I mean, individuals in the community, sure, but it's the community. And so I guess I'm wondering, to what extent is what you're doing aimed at empowering communities to be self-sufficient, to have control over the resources? Basically, what are you doing with the royalties when you're telling other people's stories? What are you doing with the power that you get as a law professor, as opposed to empowering the people who actually have lived experience, frontline experience, to do some of this stuff by and for themselves?
Take this one more question, and then we've got a question, and then we'll.
Yeah, so just the question from a public policy standpoint, what's a realistic and palatable first step that government or public policy makers can take towards achieving some of these goals you're describing?
They're like opposite questions. I don't expect any book royalties, but should I get them, I do have an agreement with the National Bail Fund Network to figure out how to distribute. I have it in writing, but it's not something I'm expecting to happen. But I think beyond, so book writing doesn't lead to a lot of money, but it does lead to other things, right? Privileged discussions that are become on YouTube for a long time. And in this discussion, we have 3 law professors, but I know both of us are very often in conversation with organizers who are trying to lift up in various ways. I was on Democracy Now! Yesterday with Tracy McCarter, who's in the book, and she's incredible. You should go watch the video. She just won an essay contest writing about her experiences that are in the book. And the hope is to help her develop that into a book. And so to talk about the Tracys and the Joyces of the world, I think is part of what we're trying to do. I don't know if you want to pick up from there.
Yeah, so the organizations that I'm closest to are all very community-focused organizations. Their work is to empower communities. The idea is to strengthen communities so that the communities can provide the resources as opposed to relying on an agency that is threatening, terroristic, taking children away. And so what I try to do is work with those organizations toward the goal of community empowerment. And as I said, it's what they say is helpful for me to do, including supporting them financially as well. That's part of it as well. They all need financial support. I think that bail funds are one of the best ways you can use your money, because you know it's going directly to helping somebody get out of a cage. But of these other organizations as well are working on community empowerment in various ways. I mean, we didn't really have time to talk about all the concrete ways. Of course, Jocelyn has very detailed descriptions of those ways, and in Torn Apart, I talk about many of the things that family policing abolitionists are doing. Again, mostly focusing on strengthening community resources.
And I'd love to circle back to the last question. Public policies that are concrete and palatable. I think one question is palatable to whom? Because one of the things that the groups that I followed in this book and ended up writing about have been doing is trying to actually shift what's palatable. So coalitions that get together to rethink local budgeting are trying to literally shift this category of money that goes to public safety and say, we have a category of money for public safety, but it's not including policing, it's including other things, whether it's lighting in public housing developments, education, infrastructure, or forms of violence prevention, whatever it might be. And so concretely, I could say, give more money to violence prevention rather than to policing. But the question about whether that's palatable depends on how you talk about it. And I would hesitate to look for what's palatable now in the pages of the leading newspaper, and more, how are people on the ground talking about what they want from, say, public safety, to use the example at the time.
Anything that supports people, that meets human needs apart from these carceral, terroristic, punitive systems. Anything, providing housing, good nutrition, education, universal health care, all of that, putting the money away from the carceral systems and into what's going to go into the hands of people and families and communities is a policy that is going to help. I mean, it should be palatable. It should be. We know that, we know, for example, that putting income in people's hands is the best way to reduce child poverty and what is considered neglect. So we know that works, and it should be palatable. Ending mandated reporting. As Jocelyn says right now, people say, how could you possibly do that? But if you think logically about it and you understand the harms of it, might actually get support for ending that. Again, I don't have time to go into why that makes sense, but it would make children safer by having people who can actually support families and do it, as opposed to just turning people into the Child Protective Services. So that's just one example. There are lots of them. But basically, meeting people's needs without punishing them. That would be a basic policy route that would be a lot better than what we do now.
At the risk of getting in trouble, there's one more question. I know you've had your hand raised for a while, so we will end it right after this question.
There's a saying in Africa, I'm an African, okay? So I just have been thinking of, these discussions. Others that have participated in Brazil. There's a saying that the child that's not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. It's an African proverb, and I'm an African. I've been hearing, we've been talking about safety, democracy, enslavement, and then even the act of of the system legalizing or legitimately kidnapping children. Mm-hmm. I'm a bit saddened by this, but I would like to ask how, this reflects international policy, because, the U.S. talks about, so much about democracy, but it looks like some people in this very system, or the system is made in a way that is to criminalize certain people. And later, it looks like, people from here will go to certain places and try to tell them to do their homework.
Right.
How does this, frankly, reflect or the U.S. international policy? And how can we, in a way,